This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On today's show, Steve Coll, an award-winning journalist, has investigated the power of a sovereign empire. This one is called exxon-mobil, and he reveals the stunning degree to which one corporation controls not only the Republican Party, but most of the world. Professor Suzanne Mettler answers the question as to why so many people who hate government and think they don't get anything from it actually are getting tons of federal aid. They just don't see it because it's part of what she calls the submerged state. And Bill Press talks with Michele Waslin of the Immigration Policy Center. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. President George W. Bush threatened to designate an Indonesian group as terrorist unless it stopped attacking Exxon. Journalist Steve Coll paints an astonishing portrait of a corporation that tries to run not only the United States, but the rest of the world. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Steve Coll, who is president of New America Foundation and a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. Previously, he spent 20 years as a foreign correspondent and senior editor at the Washington Post, serving as the paper's managing editor from 1998 to 2004. The winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, he is the author of 7 books, and most recently, Private Empire, exxon-mobil, and American Power. Steve Coll, thanks for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you say in your new book that Exxon has the revenue size equivalent to the GDP of Norway. What does that tell us about a corporation whose economic size is comparable to an entire national state?
Well, they are kind of a state unto themselves, I think is what it tells us. They are a sort of international sovereign that has the resources and the durable business model, oil, to function independently of any state, including the United States, where it's headquartered.
Now, you report that ExxonMobil gives a higher percentage of its political action committee spending to Republican candidates than almost any other of the large politically active corporations. How do other corporations manage their PACs differently?
Well, the larger ones that I looked at in recent years have split their money more along 50-50 lines between the two parties. I think under a theory of all-weather strategy and all-weather access, and also recognition that we live in a two-party system. And when you're a large publicly traded corporation, you have diverse shareholders, diverse employees, and to some extent, these corporations seem to interpret their political responsibilities as kind of to represent the breadth of owners and employees that they have. ExxonMobil, on the other hand, has a very different approach. They gave more than 90% of their political action committee donations in the 2010 cycle to Republican candidates, and were leaning even more heavily that way in the first part of the 2012 cycle. And this reflects an attitude of really an ideology at the top of the corporation. The current chairman and chief executive, Rex Tillerson, recently told a magazine that his favorite book is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, a sort of dystopian novel that's a touchstone for libertarians and the Tea Party movement. The corporation's headquartered in Texas, and ironically, it lives in a kind of opposition to the state that gave birth to it, to the United States.
Now, how has ExxonMobil dealt with the Obama administration and the Democratic Party in recent years? I mean, has it hurt the corporation to be so closely tied with Republicans?
I think it's been a problem for them. Yeah, in some respects, they were pretty slow to recognize the wave of Democratic revival that began in the 2006 cycle when the Democratic Party retook the House. They really didn't even see until September of that year that the Democrats were on their way back to control of the House, and they were a little bit at a loss about how to open up a conversation with Democrats. They did have a good, long-standing relations with what they would regard as pro-industry Democrats. John Dingell, who represented Michigan, was someone they felt that they could talk to. And in general, the Clinton administration they found relatively friendly because the Clintons had raised money from the Fortune 500 corporations during the 90s as part of their competitive strategy in American politics, and so they built relationships in industrial America. But the Obama administration, the Obama candidacy, the Obama campaign really didn't have that kind of relationship with the oil industry or industrial companies. They were raising money from Wall Street and Silicon Valley and Hollywood, but the oil industry was something President Obama kind of ran explicitly against in 2008, and that made it hard for ExxonMobil to establish ties once Obama came to office.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Steve Coll, president of New America Foundation, staff writer for The New Yorker, author of 7 books, most recently Private Empire, ExxonMobil, and American Power, which is what we're talking a little bit about today. Steve, how does ExxonMobil manage to extract the oil wealth from Nigeria, Chad, and other African countries where the human rights records are abysmal and the governments are often in turmoil?
Well, their view is that they really only have one role in this world, and that's to discover and produce oil and gas, and that nation building is not their business, and that they cannot pick the governments that they partner with because otherwise they wouldn't have access to enough oil and gas. And so they've succeeded over a long period of time in essentially avoiding responsibility for the conduct of the governments in some of these particularly weak states and unstable states in Africa. As you point out, academic economists and political scientists have long documented what is known as the resource curse, which is the pattern in which poor countries, when they attempt to lead their development through oil development or mining, they tend to not benefit the broader population, but instead enrich narrow elites by corruption, establishment of Swiss bank accounts, and other skimming, in effect, of this oil and gas production. And one aspect of the resource curse is that producing oil in these weak states induces instability because the oil wealth turns the country into a kind of bank waiting to be robbed. Anybody who can capture the presidential palace in a coup or a guerrilla war, the next day they've got a $30 million Swiss bank account, in effect, because the cash is so out of proportion to the natural shape and size of the economy. And certainly these countries where ExxonMobil is operating in West Africa today, Chad, Equatorial and Guinea, and Nigeria in particular, are quite unstable in that way.
Mm-hmm. You also report that Exxon was involved in or knew about torture of Indonesian guerrillas by forces paid by the company. Now, what human rights questions are involved when a company like Exxon drills in a war zone?
Well, that's the fundamental question is, how do you take responsibility as a corporation for the conduct of security services that are protecting your oil and gas properties in the midst of violence, small wars, guerrilla activity? And the case you cite in Indonesia in the province of Aceh is the most serious one that ExxonMobil has yet been involved in. At that time, between the late 1990s up until 2004, 2005, a separatist guerrilla movement was challenging the government of Indonesia, and Exxon's gas field was the big prize in that war, and the field was protected by Indonesian soldiers whose salaries were paid under contract by ExxonMobil. Now, those soldiers deployed around the perimeter of the gas field's fences and set up detention facilities where they brought suspected guerrillas and tortured them, and in some cases killed them and buried them right around the fence of the Exxon gas field. Now, there's a lawsuit pending in federal court brought by some of the victims of this torture and activity and their widows and estates against Exxon, accusing the corporation of knowing enough to be responsible for this violence. And the case has never seen trial because Exxon keeps appealing it. But evidence has been discovered by some of the lawyers, and what it shows is that Exxon was clearly in communication with these Indonesian units. And my own interviews suggest that they were certainly aware that these units did not have an exemplary human rights record. In fact, there are memos and emails that demonstrate Exxon's awareness of at least the bad record in general that these forces had. Now, whether they're legally liable, I hope a jury will someday have a chance to decide.
And I got to say, it really blows me away that pressure can't be put on a corporation like this that would keep them from doing it, or just show some sort of culpability or even remorse for what's going on. And in fact, but you also report that the Bush administration threatened to designate a guerrilla group in Indonesia as a terrorist organization unless it stopped attacking ExxonMobil facilities. So why did they intervene, the Bush administration, that is, and then what happened?
Well, that's, in the same war, this guerrilla group called the Free Aceh Movement, known by its local initials as GAM, was attacking ExxonMobil's gas fields precisely because they felt that ExxonMobil was culpable because of this torture that we were discussing earlier. And the Bush administration sought out a private meeting with GAM leadership and essentially said to them, we have these terrorist lists. You're not on them because we regard you as a regional separatist organization. But if you keep attacking ExxonMobil, we're going to put you on them. And literally the title is drawn from a quotation from a Bush administration official whose words were disclosed in a table that I obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. And he says to the guerrillas, "Do you really want us as an enemy?" Meaning the United States and ExxonMobil alike. And in fact, in the face of that threat, GAM stopped attacking ExxonMobil.
Unbelievable stuff. Steve Coll, president of New America Foundation, staff writer for The New Yorker magazine. He's the author of 7 books, most recently Private Empire, ExxonMobil, and American Power. Steve, as always, we appreciate your time with us on americasdemocrats.org and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Coming up in just a few minutes, why do so many people think that welfare is bad, but the home mortgage tax deduction is good? According to Professor Suzanne Mettler, it's because so much of federal largesse is hidden from view. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
To measure how our economy is doing, media outlets keep a constant eye on the Dow Jones average. But they're like cats watching the wrong mouse hole, for the great majority of Americans have between 0 and next to nothing in the stock market. The economic measure that matters most to most folks is the Doug Jones average. The Doug is concerned about such key indicators as the pump price on a gallon of regular, the subprime value of today's 7.25 minimum wage, and the impact of global inflationary pressures on the cost of a six-pack. So, how are Doug and Dottie Jones doing? The number crunchers at the Federal Reserve have just answered that for us. Not well. Not well at all. In its latest survey of consumer finances, the Fed found that from 2007 to 2010, all but the wealthiest 10% of American households have been downwardly mobile. The median net worth of U.S. households tumbled in those 4 years by a startling 39%, falling to the lowest level in 20 years. In short, Americans are not merely feeling poorer, they are. Foreclosures, lost jobs, wage declines, and other reductions, combined with rising costs of everything from gasoline to child care, have become the norm, shoving many proud middle-classers into poverty. Yet Washington remains fixated on the Dow Jones average and the stock market elite, with Republican leaders even clamoring for a return to the disastrous policies of trickle-down economics that caused this decline. This is Jim Hightower saying, meanwhile, 3/4 of Americans today have more invested in their aging cars than in stocks. With the consumer economy busted, America's cars are now, on average, 11 years old. Restoring American prosperity begins with restoring the Joneses to the middle class. It's percolate-up economics that we need, not tinkle down.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Political scientist Suzanne Mettler asks what happens when government benefits are hidden from view. She answers that the rich benefit and the rest of us don't. And we're joined now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, by Suzanne Mettler, the Clinton Rossiter Professor of American Institutions at Cornell University. Professor Mettler conducts research and teaches on American politics and public policy, and her most recent book is The Submerged State: How Invisible Government Policies Undermine American Democracy. Suzanne Mettler, thanks for joining us again today on americasdemocrats.org.
Oh, delighted to be back, Jim.
And nice to speak with you again as well. Why don't we start off by kind of reminding some of our listeners, what exactly are you referring to when you say the submerged state?
By the submerged state, I mean public policies that are relatively hidden to ordinary citizens because of their design. Instead of them being checks that people receive from government or goods and services that they receive fairly directly from government, instead these policies are either channeled through the tax code or government gives subsidies to private organizations, which in turn give benefits to citizens. And so it's very hard for people to see they exist. And as a result of this, ordinary citizens know little about them, have few opinions about them, and are not mobilized around them. But interest groups, the industries that benefit from them, are highly mobilized, and they work to protect them, keep them intact. And these policies are very costly. They mostly benefit high-income people and particular industries, and they're bad for American democracy.
Now, does this mean that the more well-off people assume that they're deserving of aid, like the home mortgage interest deductions, but others are not deserving of, say, food stamps?
Well, that tends to be the case, yes. So when we design public policies, we do it in different ways for different groups of people. Interestingly, most of our policies for low-income people are quite direct. Government's role is quite obvious in those policies, like food stamps and welfare, for example. It's policies that are benefiting higher income people, and especially when they're mostly for wealthy people, where we give them different designs and allow people to think that government's not really helping them. So this quickly becomes very entangled with political ideologies and views about deservingness, and it gets pretty complicated. I mean, since my work around this has been publicized, I've been receiving a lot of mail from people where people will say, how can you call my Social Security a government benefit? People will say. Or they will say, just because I'm paying less money in taxes because I own a home does not make me a beneficiary of government. And people act very incensed and outraged. But that's where we're getting into complications where the design of policies, I would say, is allowing people to be deluded and not to realize that they're actually benefiting from government. That, in fact, when we deliver a policy through the tax code and we allow someone to pay less in taxes, from an accounting perspective, it's exactly the same thing as sending them a welfare check. And it's the same thing in that we have a public policy that says that particular people with certain circumstances are deserving of government largesse. All that's different is the design, but the design allows people to think about what they receive, the benefit that they get, quite differently, and about their status in relationship to government very differently.
Now, I've read, you count things like Social Security, veterans benefits, toll-free, interstate highways. Well over half of all Americans are depending in some way on Washington. But you did a study or a survey, and Ezra Klein of the Washington Post made reference to this a few months back.
Yes.
Where you and tell us about it. I guess you posed the question to people, and most of the people they didn't think they were on any sort of government program, and the fact of the matter was almost all of them were. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, so I did a telephone survey a couple of years ago where the very first question was, have you ever benefited from a government social program? And 57% of the respondents said no. The rest said yes. Then we went on in the course of this lengthy telephone survey to ask people about 21 specific federal social welfare policies. Have you ever used Medicaid? Have you ever used Social Security? Have you ever used the home mortgage interest deduction? And it turned out that almost everybody said yes to at least one of those policies. And the people who had said no to the very first question about ever using them, this was also the case for them, that all but 6% of them went on later to say yes, they had used something. The average person had used 4 policies from the federal government, and usually that was 2 of the direct policies and 2 more submerged policies. So it's extremely common to use government social benefits, and it's very common to use both kinds, to use both the direct and the submerged. It's, at this point, part of the American experience.
We've talked in the past about the President Obama beginning to scale back some of this submerged state, but he's obviously run into some pushback. Why is it so difficult to scale back the submerged state?
Well, it's difficult in the first place because ordinary citizens don't have strong opinions about it. They don't know much about these policies or how they work because political leaders talk about them so little. So they're not mobilized. So it quickly becomes something that's dominated by interest groups. And these interest groups, like the National Association of Realtors and even the trade association that represents philanthropic groups that like the charitable contributions deduction, all of these groups are mobilized year in and year out, and they make campaign contributions to elected officials and to candidates on both sides of the aisle. They do extensive lobbying. The amount of money they've spent on these things has increased dramatically over time. And so as soon as it seems that they are threatened, they can do a mobilization, and they can count on their friends on both sides of the aisle to stand up and say, oh, we're not going to touch this policy, and they stay intact.
Because their constituents would have nothing to do with that. Don't take money out of my pocket. I mean, that's the bottom line, right?
The constituents never have a chance to even enter the debate, really, because these things tend to be shut down much more quickly before journalists are covering them and before the public even knows what's happening. But it tends to be something that happens just inside of Washington, where the interest groups are mobilized.
We're speaking with Suzanne Mettler, the Clinton Rossiter Professor of American Institutions at Cornell University, discussing her most recent book, The Submerged State, How Invisible Government Policies Undermine American Democracy. So how do you go about revealing it to citizens? Because let's face it, if more folks understood, had a better understanding of what this is all about, what this submerged state is, I mean, you'd be calling your congressman and your congresswoman, the mayor. You'd be calling anybody you can to say, "Hey, wait a minute, we've got to fix this," right?
Yes, that's right. Well, and one of the things I will say before I talk about strategies to make things better, one of the things that's made it more difficult today is the kind of ideological polarization that is going on, both on Capitol Hill and also in the general population. People like to make fun of the person at the healthcare town meeting back in 2009 who said to the member of Congress, "Keep the government out of my Medicare." And of course, how ridiculous. Medicare is a government program. And so many people have suggested, this sort of highlights what I'm getting at. But I like to respond that individual might not have been as foolish as he sounded, because by that year, about 1/4 of Medicare recipients were actually receiving their benefits through something called Medicare Advantage that was actually channeled through private insurance companies. And so people can, have good reason for not understanding that they're benefiting from government social programs. So the design of policies is part of the problem. But there's also ideology. And this has become so powerful. Now, in the study in one of the studies I have done, we looked at how people answered that question about have you ever used a government social program, and we found that it was a matter of not only the design of the policies that people had used, but also their political ideology. The more conservative the person was, the more likely he or she was to answer that question by saying no, even if the individual received the same number of benefits as an extreme liberal. The extreme liberal was much more likely to say yes, and the extreme conservative much more likely to say no. I've never used a government social program.
So does that mean that the conservative members, who denounce the federal government, actually are recipients of a lot of federal aid themselves?
Yes, they do tend to be. I mean, most Americans, nearly all Americans, receive quite a bit of aid from the government, whether they are liberal or conservative. But it is much easier for liberals to admit it because they don't have the sense of stigma about those policies, and that they don't believe it's wrong to receive government social programs the way conservatives do. So for conservatives, there's a kind of a mental disconnect between their receipt of these policies and their willingness to say, yes, I benefit from government social policies. They're much more likely to explain it away as saying, well, when I pay less in taxes, that's not me receiving a government benefit. Or, well, my Social Security is something that I deserve because I paid into it for years.
Mm-hmm. So
the design makes it complicated, and then our ideology, if one is a conservative, it makes it all the more complicated. Is my point.
But so how do you get this message out? I mean, I get it. I understand what you're saying. You need a bigger phone bank or something to create a bigger survey. I mean, how do we educate the general public and let them realize and make a decision on their own?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'm going to might sound very modest, but I think it's actually politically feasible, and it could make a real difference. I think that in the delivery of these policies, we could simply tell people that these are government social benefits. So, for example, after we pay our taxes every year, I think we should receive a tax receipt on one page that says, this is what you paid in taxes, and these are the amounts of your social benefits in the tax code, and it would list, this is how much you got from the home mortgage interest deduction, and this is how much you got from the child and dependent care deduction, and so forth and so on, so that it would be laid out to people. Because I think people have no idea. I mean, if they hand off their taxes to an accountant, they don't know. And frankly, even when you do your taxes yourself, it's pretty complicated, and people don't have a sense of what their benefit is. So I think that's one way we could do it. Through delivery in that sort of way. Mm-hmm. Similarly, for example, when we give students student loans, which is now it's direct student loans, we could again, send them a sheet of paper where they see what the cost is going to be to them over time compared to what the cost would be if they were going to a bank on their own and getting a private loan, and what the interest rate would look like over time, and what their payments would be 10 years from now, so that they would have a sense of what the benefit is that they're receiving from government.
I love that idea of receiving that with your tax, with the tax return. I'm just, here's what you're buying into.
Exactly.
I mean, that's your bill. No, it's a bill of sale almost.
It's the most obvious thing. It's the kind of thing that organizations in the private sector do, but government just hasn't had ways of communicating what it does well to citizens. And, some might think of this as a marketing strategy. I think it's simply informing citizens. So people are very misinformed about government. They know very little about it because government is sort of still in the dark ages in terms of this kind of communication. that other kinds of organizations do on a regular basis.
Very interesting, and I wish we had more time to discuss it, but it just means we're going to have you back again. Suzanne Mettler, the Clinton Rossiter Professor of American Institutions at Cornell University. The book, The Submerged State, How Invisible Government Policies Undermine American Democracy. Suzanne, thank you so much again for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we will have you back again soon.
Thanks so much. I've enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Michele Waslin of the Immigration Policy Center about President Obama's decision to defer action against young undocumented immigrants.
There's been so much attention to the heckler in the Rose Garden on Friday, the rude heckler from Daily Caller, who interrupted the president. And you heard me say yesterday, I think should be therefore banned from any future events at the White House and not allowed to represent anybody at the White House. But there's been so much attention to that. There's been too little attention, in my judgment, paid to what the president announced with the help of Secretary Janet Napolitano on Friday, which is a very bold and a very far-reaching revision to America's immigration policies. So talk about that policy and all the dimensions of it and the implications of it. We are pleased to welcome to the program Michele Waslin is the Senior Policy Analyst at the Immigration Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. Michele, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So,
Good morning.
So first of all, if you could just outline briefly, what is new about this policy? Let's put it that way.
Well, this is a policy of deferred action. This is basically exercising prosecutorial discretion, meaning that the administration will choose not to expend its resources deporting certain people. This is an expansion of a program on prosecutorial discretion that they announced last year. And basically on Friday, the president and Janet Napolitano said that kids who had been brought here by their parents at a young age, who are here undocumented or illegally, will not be enforcement priorities. They will be receiving what's called deferred action. Deferred action does not give them any immigration status. It doesn't put them on the road to a green card. It doesn't grant them citizenship. It's not an amnesty. It simply means that they will not be deported if they meet all of the eligibility criteria.
Right,
So,
and the eligibility criteria include, as you point out, they were brought here by their parents, younger than the age of 15. They've been here at least 5 years. They've graduated from high school or they've served in the military. They don't have a criminal record, so they're not like a threat to our national security, right?
or they're still in high school.
Okay.
And they have to be under 30 years old.
Under 30. Okay, now, from the point of view of the Immigration Policy Center, is this a good policy?
Definitely. This is great news. You know, the DREAM Act is a bill that's been introduced in Congress for many years now. It used to be a bipartisan bill. It's unfortunately not anymore. And so this group of students is known as the Dreamers. And the Dreamers have been organizing and working very hard and applying pressure and joining forces with other important sectors and pushing for relief for these kids for so long. And, you know, the DREAM Act, unfortunately, has not made it through Congress. It's not made it into law. And this is a way that the president has really stepped up, shown his support, and has granted some form of temporary relief to these kids. And polls show that a vast number of Americans support this. The kids are an incredibly sympathetic group, and really deserve to be able to really start their lives here in the U.S.
In fact, I saw this morning the latest Bloomberg poll shows that 64% of Americans approve of this new policy. I mean, that's not among Latinos only. That's 64% of Americans across the board approve of the new policy. But what do you say, Michele, to the old chestnut argument? Well, we're just giving, these people are taking jobs from Americans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any truth to that at all?
Well, I think that is false. I think that we really need to be expanding our economy, and these are kids who are smart, who will be productive, who will be paying taxes, contributing. There are many who will be entrepreneurs, who will be creating jobs. And I think that these are exactly the kinds of people that we need in our economy. It's funny that at the same time there is a kind of a legislative debate right now about making it easier for entrepreneurs to immigrate to the U.S., making it easier for people who graduate from U.S. colleges especially with degrees in science and technology and engineering, to get their green cards. Mm-hmm. Yet these are students that
who are already here.
Grew up here. They're practically, in all aspects American. They speak English. They're from here. They're graduating from our high schools and our colleges. We should start with this group of students.
And how many are we talking about?
We often hear that there are about 64,000 students that graduate from U.S. high schools every year that are undocumented. The Pew Hispanic Center and the Migration Policy Institute just put out new updated estimates of how many people might be eligible under these criteria, and I believe the number is just about 1 million.
About 1 million people. Now, the Republicans seem to have been caught off guard by this action by the president, and we've heard various people, but what the main complaint seems to be, there are two complaints I want to ask you about. The first complaint is that this is just a fix-it. It's like a Band-Aid. It's a short term. And so why did President Obama wait so long to do this and do it just as a short-term measure? What's your response?
That's pretty funny hearing it coming from the Republican Party, which has essentially blocked every attempt to do something.
They killed the DREAM Act, right?
Well, yes, like I said, DREAM Act used to be bipartisan. The Republican sponsors pulled out, refused to support it. Mm-hmm. We could have had a permanent solution years ago, and it hasn't been done. It's also those same Republicans in many cases saying that this is outside of the president's authority, that he cannot do this. So how can they say it's been too long and why did he wait, yet he shouldn't be doing this at all in the first place?
And the second complaint is a personal one. Marco Rubio telling David Muir from ABC News last night, it seems like his feelings are hurt a little bit over the way this came down. Here's Senator Rubio.
I'm glad you asked about the DREAM Act because I have an alternative to it. And I've never gotten a call from a single person at the White House about it. If they really wanted to work on a solution, why wouldn't someone call me?
Poor baby, nobody called him. Does he really wonder why nobody called him from the White House?
Well, first of all, I don't think we need an alternative to the DREAM Act. I think Senator Rubio should support the DREAM Act. Secondly, he's been talking about this for a really long time and has not put anything on paper, has not introduced a bill. So I don't think he should be surprised that somebody else did something first.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the right policy, and I think it's the right politics. Both a win-win for the president. Michele Waslin is the senior policy analyst at the Immigration Policy Center. You can find out more about the president's policy and what it means at their website, immigrationpolicy.org. Immigrationpolicy.org. Thanks, Michele. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for your good work. Yeah. What do you think? 866-55-PRESS. This is a 10 strike, I believe, on the part of the president. Again, it's really great when the right thing to do for America is also politically the right thing to do. And President Obama's got the Republicans on the rope on this thing. The headline in The Hill this morning is GOP reels after deft Obama move. Deft. You don't hear that word very much, but this was a deft move for sure.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Steve Coll, Suzanne Mettler, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.